In January 1951, Chinese forces marched into Seoul, shocking the U.S. and its UN allies. It was becoming clear that the battle-hardened Chinese were a formidable enemy. Over the months that followed, American leadership would face the hard question: was victory possible, and at what price? Or were stalemate and negotiation the only options?
MacArthur would say, this isn't war, this is murder. You've confined this entire conflict to one small area, and you're just pulverizing that area over and over again. He said, I'm a witness of 50 campaigns, and it was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. I threw up the last time I was there because all it is just rubble, the entire country.
General Curtis LeMay explained that they had to stop their bombing runs over Pyongyang because they'd run out of targets. Think what that means.
America had one huge advantage, but the decision whether or not to use it would confront Harry Truman with one of the most difficult choices of his presidency.
The Korean War was all about preventing World War III.
He had already ordered the use of atomic weapons against Japan in World War II. Would the president once again play the nuclear card and risk sparking a global war with both China and the Soviet Union?
In the simplest terms, what we're doing in Korea is this: we're trying to prevent a third world war.
Welcome back to the Unauthorized History of the Korean War. In 1950, Mao's decision to deploy Red Army troops against UN forces changed the entire calculus of the conflict. UN and Chinese troops now faced off on the ground. In the airspace over Korea, Russian and American pilots engaged with each other directly in the world's first jet-powered dogfights. For American leadership, what had started as a proxy war in a faraway country now seemed dangerously close to becoming a global conflict. On November 28, 1950, President Truman gathered his key advisors at the White House. The Chinese have come in with both feet, he told them. It was the nightmare scenario he had hoped to avoid, and that General Douglas MacArthur had promised him would never come to pass.
Once the Chinese came in, nobody in Washington is backing up MacArthur for what has happened. The press is hammering MacArthur, using him as, you screwed up, this is your fault, everything. You've even got some people in the press saying that it was all MacArthur's idea to cross the 38th parallel. He had done it on his own, which wasn't true.
To reinforce the UN's position, MacArthur once again recommended bringing in troops from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese army, situated in nearby Taiwan. The White House refused, fearing such a move would unleash a wider conflict that would engulf all of Asia. The looming question was whether the war could be won by UN forces and conventional weapons alone, or whether more would be needed.
I think there was probably a feeling among the general public, yes, we had the big bomb, nobody can compete with us. The problem with that is, are we willing to use that in any kind of conflict? We could have used it on Pyongyang, and had we decided to do that, obviously that would have been a game changer.
Our homes, our nation, all the things we believe in are in great danger.
At a press conference on November 30th, President Truman seemed to suggest that the nuclear option was a possibility, telling reporters, quote, "We will take whatever steps are necessary to meet the military situation, just as we always have."
But we will not engage in appeasement.
Asked whether that included using the atomic bomb, he answered, quote, "That includes every weapon that we have."
America's strategic plan in both Europe and Asia was always, nuclear weapons are a part of our military policy. If we find it necessary to use them, we will. And certainly the Chinese did not have nuclear weapons at that time. So the only question would be, how many of these would it take to win the war?
When pressed on who would make the ultimate decision to launch an atomic weapon, the president, famous for saying the buck stops here, seemed to pass responsibility to MacArthur. Quote, "It's a matter that the military people will have to decide."
I think what Truman was trying to do was to try to use the leverage of the nuclear weapon as a warning to the Chinese. But I don't think he really had any intention of using it, because I think that he really wanted to end the war as quickly as possible. But also, it probably influenced MacArthur. He probably said, if you're going to make that threat, I've got to follow through.
President Truman heads a group of high government officials welcoming Prime Minister Clement Attlee of England.
Truman's mention of the nuclear option alarmed his UN allies. The British Prime Minister rushed to Washington, fearing that a nuclear conflict in Asia would inevitably spread to Europe. Truman assured him that any action would be limited to Korea alone.
They are very worried about this. They're very worried about World War III. They're worried about a Soviet drive into Western Europe while the United States is fully committed to Korea and a war with China. After that is when the United States, I think, starts to really feel that they want to get out of this. They don't want to get embroiled in a war with China and have to rebuild and then maybe bring on this Third World War, which, they are definitely trying to avoid.
MacArthur kept pressing his case, arguing for allowing U.S. bombers to cross into Manchuria to destroy Chinese supply depots. In his words, Truman's limitations on the war effort were, quote, "an enormous handicap without precedent in military history."
I think MacArthur really changed from defending South Korea, liberating the Korean Peninsula, to really defeating China. Once they have entered the war, for him, China was now the main enemy. He was restricted, not able to bomb targets in China. And of course, Chinese aircraft and Soviet piloted aircraft were able to use that sanctuary to be able to attack. We had the famous MiG Alley. They would be able to run down that and engage in fights with our aircraft and then return to sanctuary. So MacArthur wanted to be able to attack into China. And I think he was focused on trying to be able to get permission to fight in China and defeat the Chinese and ultimately to destroy the People's Republic of China.
MacArthur did request that nuclear assets be put at his disposal, anticipating the possibility of Soviet escalation and a widening of the conflict. But, in contrast to much that has been written since the end of the war, experts say there is no historical record that MacArthur actually asked to use nuclear weapons in Korea when he was in command.
MacArthur made the statement, I see the opportunity for an atomic bomb, sweeten up my B-29 force. Was he really saying, I plan on using an atomic bomb? No, I think he wanted more B-29s more than anything else. Does he ever say, I want to use nuclear weapons in Korea? There is no evidence that he ever asked to use them. And that's the thing, this is what you hear most about MacArthur, is that he wanted to drop nuclear weapons. But during the war, he never asked for them. When he wants to respond to what the Chinese did, he wants to put a naval blockade on China. He wants to use Chiang Kai-shek's troops off the island of Formosa. He wants to bomb those Manchurian bases conventionally, but never asked for nukes, nuclear weapons at that time.
In an interview published after his death, MacArthur did describe a plan that he said could have won the war in just 10 days. Quote, "I would have dropped 30 or so atomic weapons strung across the neck of Manchuria. He would have introduced 500,000 Chinese national troops and then, quote, spread a belt of radioactive cobalt behind us from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea. It has an active life of between 60 and 120 years. For at least 60 years, there could have been no land invasion of Korea from the north." End quote.
MacArthur did think that nuclear weapons could be used tactically on the battlefield. I have seen no evidence of any deep briefings of MacArthur on the ramifications of using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And as we know from our own testing in Utah, we put live soldiers out in areas that had just been hit by atomic bombs. So the overall appreciation of radiation exposure, radiation sickness, I don't think was well understood by many in the military at the time.
I think the way Truman and MacArthur viewed nuclear weapons, I think Truman looked at it from the human point of view, the devastation, the human cost. And I think, frankly, MacArthur looked at it from the military necessity point. I think that's the two different views. I think MacArthur's point, you've got to win at all costs, and I've got to use all of the capabilities that are available to ensure victory. But Truman, of course, had a much bigger view of, not only the human devastation, but also the second and third order effects with the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons and how that would change the face of war. Truman seemed to want to put nuclear weapons back in the box.
On the ground in Korea, UN troops began to push back the Chinese, with some success. In March 1951, UN troops re-entered Seoul. For Truman, the scene was set for settlement. To MacArthur, it seemed victory was in sight. The president began preparing to negotiate a ceasefire. When MacArthur got word of an impending White House statement offering terms for peace, he preempted the president by issuing his own communique, warning Beijing, surrender or war may be unleashed against the mainland.
The administration wants to have a talk with the Chinese. They want to come to a peace conference, end this war. And Truman's going to put out a peace feeler to the Chinese. Next day, MacArthur puts out his own press statement to the Chinese generals. I've destroyed you in the field, surrender now, or I'll destroy everything about China. And there goes Truman's peace feeler, right out the window. And now Truman's like, what do I do with this? Do I keep him in Japan? Do I let Ridgway just run this? Do I bring him home? How are we going to deal with this situation with MacArthur?
MacArthur again told his allies in Congress that he recommended bringing in the nationalist Chinese to help fight in Korea.
It was this kind of fantasy that we're going to bring in this massive army of nationalist Chinese who are not going to be any more accepted by the Koreans than the North Koreans or the communist Chinese or the Japanese were. It's just a fantasy. But it's one of those imaginary what-ifs that people keep throwing out there. Well, what if we brought in the nationalist Chinese to help in the war? It would have only antagonized the communist Chinese more.
The rift between the president and the general was now on public display, putting in sharp relief the question of whether civilian control of the military could survive in the nuclear age.
Truman was really struggling with, how do I relieve him? He had to try to find a way to do it where he would be able to survive politically. By now, we're starting to go into the 52 election, so Truman has to think politically, and he didn't want to relieve MacArthur because he would retire from the army and then run for president against him. And so that was hanging over this.
He was faced with a situation where his own military commander in the Pacific was acting in such a way as to risk World War III breaking out over China. Stopping that possibility took tremendous political courage on Truman's part, because MacArthur was a much bigger hero than Harry Truman.
After MacArthur ruins that peace feeler and they're trying to figure out what do we do with this guy, then Joe Martin, probably the most rabid anti-Truman Republican in Congress, reads this letter that MacArthur has written to him saying, why aren't we using Chiang's troops? We should get them involved. We should never let Formosa go. And that's when Truman's like, he's totally in policy now. He's trying to change policy within the United States. And that's when Truman and then gets his advisors together. And that's when they decide that they're going to get rid of MacArthur.
Finally, Truman said, I have to do what's right. And I cannot trust MacArthur. And he has got to follow the orders of the president. And he is not doing that. And so he made the very tough decision to relieve a 5-star general.
At 1 a.m. on April 11th, 1951, the White House made the announcement. MacArthur was out.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
When MacArthur left Japan, the road to the airport was lined with Japanese people waving flowers as he left the country. He was an immense figure. So that was very difficult for Truman.
Within days, MacArthur was on the tarmac in Tokyo. His military career was over. He returned to America and received a hero's welcome. 12,000 supporters greeted his 1 a.m. arrival in Washington, his first return to the city in 15 years. In what was viewed as a bipartisan rebuke to President Truman, congressional Republicans and Democrats united to invite the general to address a joint session. MacArthur defended the positions that had led to his dismissal.
In war, there is no substitute for victory. There are some who, for varying reasons, would appease Red China. They are blind to history's clear lesson. For history teaches with unmistakable emphasis that appeasement but begets new and bloodier war. Why, my soldiers asked of me, surrender military advantages to an enemy in the field? I could not answer.
MacArthur ended his speech by quoting an old Army song, bidding farewell to a military career he had built over a half a century of continuous service.
Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
While his time in uniform had ended, MacArthur had no plans to retire from public life. He had his eye on the White House, and many urged him to run against the commander-in-chief who had cut short his career.
MacArthur was surprised. I think he was so full of so much self-confidence, even though he had suffered the worst fate of a military commander, maybe worse than death, is to be relieved of command.
Troops of the United Nations maintain their vigilance and refuse to give up ground to the communist hordes without exacting a heavy toll for every foot of ground.
General Matthew Ridgway, already in Korea, heading up the 8th Army, replaced MacArthur as Supreme Commander for UN forces in Korea. He executed the president's directive to restrain the war effort and bring the North Koreans to the negotiating table. Truman indeed was now willing to fight to a draw and barred UN troops from crossing back into North Korea. By the spring of 1951, the two sides had reached a stalemate. For American troops, the conflict became a grinding effort, made worse by the Korean weather.
I think the way to look at that situation, the stalemate, is that it was really a return almost to World War I, with trench lines, Chinese attacking at night, the bugle sounds, illumination rounds, that lighting up. And so you had these attacks back and forth across these trench lines. By the spring of 1951, the lines became pretty stable, pretty much where the demilitarized zone is today. And so there was much fighting for very little ground. And they were really just fighting for positional advantage, which really does impact morale, because if you're not fighting to win, you're not fighting to achieve the objective that you thought you went to war for, it impacts morale. And it was very tough on the soldiers. And of course, what was happening is that we were trying to negotiate a settlement. The way that the communists negotiate is very tough, very difficult, and they were long and drawn out. However, for the American military and the American soldier, Marine, airman, sailor. While we fight for our ideals, support and defend the Constitution of the United States, we really fight for the man or woman on our left and right. And so while there's a demoralizing aspect to all of this, it is the people that generate the morale, generate the confidence, generate the will to fight, because you don't want that person on your right or left to die. And so that is what makes American military units fight in the face of political challenges that are caused by our political leaders.
Despite the limitations placed on him by Truman, General Ridgway proved popular with his troops.
General Ridgway was, a hero from World War II, and he really turned morale around. He led from the front. You can see pictures of him with a hand grenade on his uniform. He was a combat soldier, and so he was there living in Korea, on the ground, going to the frontline units. And it really is a study in leadership of how Ridgway really turned around the morale of the 8th Army and the entire UN forces.
In the skies above Korea, a very different war unfolded. For the first time, aerial combat was conducted using jet-powered aircraft. American and Russian pilots engaged one another directly in dogfights that tested the limits of both U.S. and Russian technology.
Faster than the Yaks are two newer models, the Lavochkin and the MiG-15.
The Soviet aircraft were superior to U.S. aircraft. The MiGs had better turning radius and different capabilities than the Sabre jets of the U.S. However, what really made the difference was the training of American pilots, Air Force, Navy, Marine pilots. Even though our equipment was inferior, our training was superior. And we devastated the Air Force of North Korea, of China. And also what we did, we conducted extensive bombing.
The U.S.-led bombing campaign during the Korean War was really like carpet bombing. It was just extensive. And so much of Korea was just destroyed, Pyongyang and Seoul in particular. So it's heartbreaking when you see that some of these beautiful historic structures just absolutely destroyed, gone, because the bombing was so thorough. My father did remember going back. Of course, their house in Seoul was completely gone. When he was 21, he left South Korea for the United States. And the next time he went back to South Korea was in 1991, after it had been rebuilt, and he could not recognize the city at all. In North Korea, if you go to the Korean War Museum, they catalog in great detail what those bombings were like. The numbers, the extent of the damage. And so the bombing has become a huge part of the narrative about the U.S. attack on Korea. It fits the narrative that North Korea has to protect against the threat of attack from the United States.
With an impasse on the ground and a conventional bombing campaign that proved devastating to the North, talk of a nuclear option faded. The war, though exhausting for the Korean people, remained useful to the broader goals of both Moscow and Beijing. And while both China and the Soviet Union agreed to peace talks, nothing seemed enough to break the deadlock.
The air war in Korea has received less attention than it deserves, in my view. We caused more civilian casualties than happened in World War II. The reason that occurred was because the armistice negotiations lasted for so long. The U.S. was frustrated by the refusal of the communist side to agree to what the U.S. considered reasonable terms for the armistice. And so the idea was, well, if we just bomb them a little more, they'll come to their senses. Mao was determined to continue the war because he considered it the best military school possible. The Soviet Union was sending their best weapons to Korea. and training the Chinese forces and using them. Also, they were creating a modern communication system with which the People's Liberation Army didn't have. They created a modern logistics system, which the People's Liberation Army didn't have. As they were fighting in Korea, this was being created. So Mao saw it as very beneficial and wanted it to keep going. We did not know, of course, that Stalin was saying, you have to keep fighting. We now know from archival records that Stalin decided that the war was useful to the Soviet Union because it would enable them to keep Americans stuck in Korea. U.S. Army was having a hard time against the Chinese, so we can keep them stuck on the Korean Peninsula, and therefore they can't do anything in Europe against us. So we'll keep them stuck in Korea for 2 or 3 years to give us time to build strong military forces in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet bloc countries that were to be the Soviets' buffer in the West. So that's what he did.
By the end of 1952, war had raged across the Korean Peninsula for 2.5 years, and peace was still nowhere in sight. Almost 36,000 U.S. military service members had died in the conflict, along with 4,000 other UN fighters. But 1953 would bring 2 new figures onto the scene. They would change the course of the war, though not before both sides made their final push on the battlefield. Join me next time for the conclusion of the unauthorized history of the Korean War.